September 22nd, 1943, 8:12 in the morning. Somewhere beneath the dark water of a Norwegian fjord, a timer reached zero. Two men were standing on the deck of the most powerful battleship in Europe. They were British naval officers. They were prisoners, and they knew exactly what was about to happen. The ship trembled. Then it heaved. The force of 8 tons of Amatol detonating directly beneath the hull threw men off their feet, buckled 3-inch steel plate, flung a 1,000-ton gun turret off its bearings, and flooded the battleship with nearly 1,500 tons of seawater. Lieutenant Donald Cameron watched the deck pitch beneath him. He had placed those charges himself, less than an hour ago, in a submarine the size of a London bus. He was 26 years old. To understand what Cameron and his crew accomplished, you first have to understand what they were attacking. The German battleship Tirpitz was 822 feet long. She displaced 53,000 tons at full load. She carried 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling a shell the weight of a small car 22 miles. She was the largest warship ever built by Germany, and the second largest battleship in the world. She was, in the eyes of the Royal Navy, the most dangerous single object on the planet. Not because of what she did, but because of what she might do. Since early 1942, the Tirpitz had been moored in the Norwegian fjords, doing almost nothing. She had not engaged an enemy warship. She had not fired her main guns in anger. She had barely moved. She didn't have to. In July 1942, word reached an Allied Arctic convoy that the Tirpitz had sortied from her anchorage. The convoy scattered on Admiralty orders. U-boats and aircraft attacked the merchant ships one by one in open water. 24 out of 35 ships were sunk. Over 400 seamen died. The cargo destined for the Soviet front, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, went to the bottom. The Tirpitz had turned back without firing a single shot. This was called a fleet in being. The concept had been understood since the age of sail. A sufficiently powerful warship, simply by existing and threatening to move, can reshape the entire strategic picture of a war. The Tirpitz was doing exactly that. Every Allied convoy to Russia, every Arctic supply route, had to be planned around the possibility that she might appear. Churchill was enraged. The British had been trying to destroy the Tirpitz since the moment she arrived in Norway. Carrier aircraft attacked her. They missed. Bombers flew from Britain. They couldn't find her in the fjords. Human torpedo teams tried to reach her in 1942. Their submersible was detected. They were captured. The fjords, it turned out, were a near-perfect fortress. The Tirpitz was surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries, magnetic mines, 2 rings of anti-submarine nets, patrol vessels, and geography itself. Mountains on every side, a single narrow fjord entrance. She had never been touched. Then someone had an idea. Commander Cromwell Varley had a simple theory. The only way to get a weapon close enough to the Tirpitz was to make the weapon invisible. Not invisible through speed or stealth technology. Invisible through size. The X-craft, so named because the design was experimental, was, by any measure, absurd. It was 51 feet long, 5 feet wide. It had a diesel engine that powered the double-decker buses of London. It weighed 30 tons submerged. Its interior was so cramped that a man could not stand upright inside it. It carried no torpedoes, no guns. Instead, attached to its sides were 2 side charges, each one a watertight container packed with 2 tons of Amatol high explosive. The crew would maneuver beneath their target, drop the charges to the sea floor, set the timer, and run, if they could run. The men who volunteered for X-craft duty were told very little about what they were signing up for. They were interviewed, assessed, given the chance to say no. Most of them said yes anyway. They trained in the Firth of Clyde, in the sheltered waters of Loch Striven, operating out of HMS Varble, a requisitioned luxury hotel on the Isle of Bute that now served as the headquarters of the 12th Submarine Flotilla. They practiced diving in cold water, cutting anti-submarine nets with their hands, navigating blind. At sea in an X-craft, the crew of 4 rotated sleep in 4-hour shifts in the battery compartment, eating tinned food and drinking tea. The condensation ran down the walls. The diesel engine barely held against the cold. It took days to cross the North Sea. The men chosen to attack the Tirpitz were mostly young. Their average age was in the mid-20s. Several had never seen combat. Operation Source called for 6 X-craft to be towed from Scotland to the Norwegian coast by conventional submarines, a crossing of more than 1,000 miles. Passage crews would handle the journey. Then, close to the target, the operational crews would transfer at sea, climbing from submarine to submarine in the North Sea swell. 3 X-craft, X5, X6, and X7, would attack the Tirpitz and Fjord. 2 others would attack the Scharnhorst. 1 would go after the heavy cruiser Lutzow. 9 X-craft crews, 12 explosive charges, 60-plus sailors. The operation departed Scotland on September 11, 1943. It began losing boats almost immediately. On September 16th, at sea in the North Atlantic, the tow rope connecting HMS Certus to X9 parted without warning. X9's passage crew had been running with the submarine trimmed too far forward, bow down. When the tow line went, the little sub drove itself straight to the bottom. Sub-Lieutenant Karen, Able Seaman Hart, and Stoker Hollett were gone. 2 days later, X8 developed catastrophic leaks in her side charges. The charges had to be jettisoned before they imploded the hull. When they exploded, the blast was close enough to damage X8 beyond repair. She was scuttled. The mission to attack the Lutzow was abandoned. Then X10, assigned to the Scharnhorst, developed navigation and periscope failures. Her commander, unwilling to compromise the mission by probing the Fjord half-blind, turned back. The Scharnhorst, it turned out, wasn't even at her mooring. 6 boats had left Scotland. Now there were 3, and all 3 were pointed at the Tirpitz. Fjord is the innermost branch of the Altenfjord, near the northern tip of Norway, above the Arctic Circle. In late September, the days are shortening fast. The mountains rise steeply from the water's edge. Sound carries across the fjord like a whisper in a church. The Tirpitz lay at anchor here, inside 2 concentric rings of anti-submarine nets. The outer net had a gate, a movable section that opened to allow supply vessels in and out. The inner net lay directly around the ship, nets that ran 40 feet deep, designed to catch anything that approached from below. X5, X6, and X7 lay up. The night of September 21st at Bratholm Island, charging batteries, waiting for dawn. It was cold. It was dark. The men barely spoke. If Operation Source 1943, the midget submarines that wounded the Tirpitz fascinate you, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We drop a new story every single week. Now back to Operation Source 1943, the midget submarines that wounded the Tirpitz. Just before dawn on September 22nd, the outer net gate swung open to allow a Norwegian coaster to pass through. Donald Cameron was watching through his periscope. He had seconds to decide. He pushed the throttle forward, fell in behind the coaster's wake, and slipped through the gate as it was closing. He was inside. But what followed was not a smooth infiltration. It was a cascade of failures barely held together by nerve. The periscope malfunctioned. He could barely see. The gyroscope failed. Navigation became largely guesswork. The X6 ran aground on an uncharted rock and had to be rocked free. Then, catastrophically, a wave of trim caused the submarine to break the surface for a few seconds, in full view of the Tirpitz's watch. Lookouts reported a submarine. They were ignored. Nobody believed a British submarine could possibly be in Fjord. Cameron drove on. At 7:07 in the morning, X6 bumped against the keel of the Tirpitz. Cameron didn't see it coming. His periscope was barely functional. He felt the impact through the hull. He was directly beneath the greatest battleship in Europe. He released the starboard charge, swung the X6 sideways, released the port charge. 10 minutes. That was all it took. Then he surfaced. There was nothing else to do. With a broken periscope and a broken gyroscope, with German sailors now leaning over the ship's rail and staring down at him, escape was a fantasy. He opened the vents and scuttled the X6 before she could be captured intact. Then he climbed out and surrendered. Cameron and his crew of 3 were pulled from the water and taken aboard the Tirpitz. Sub-Lieutenant John Lorimer, climbing the ladder to the battleship's deck, looked around at her turrets, her guns, her sheer scale. He said later that his first thought was this: she was so pretty, it seemed an awful shame to have to blow her up. They were brought before the captain, Hans Meyer. Cameron told him directly that there were charges beneath his ship with timed fuses, and that explosions would follow within the hour. Meyer didn't disbelieve him. He ordered the Tirpitz's engine started immediately, trying to move her away from whatever lay on the seabed. The engines couldn't develop enough power in time. When German divers were sent into the water to search for the charges, Cameron leaned over the rail and warned them. The divers were recalled. Lorimer's private comment later: "They'll be mashed potato." Lieutenant Godfrey Place, meanwhile, had taken X7 into the net fields. He had gotten through the inner net once, laid his charges beneath the Tirpitz, directly beneath her propeller shafts, and then found himself unable to escape. X7 had become entangled in the nets during her withdrawal. For over an hour, Place wrestled his submarine free, dove it, tried to push through gaps, surfaced again. The nets held them. The fuses they'd set were counting down. He knew precisely what was about to happen, and he could not get clear. He had no choice but to wait. At 8:12 in the morning, the charges detonated, both at once. Cameron felt it through the steel beneath his feet. The deck of the Tirpitz jumped upward like something alive. German sailors were knocked flat. Every light on the ship went out. Smoke began to rise from below, and deep in the nets, X7 was flung free. The same shockwave that had inflicted all this damage, ripping her loose from what had been holding her, but it was too late to escape. Place surfaced his damaged submarine. 2 men, Sub-Lieutenant Lionel Whittam and Engine Room Artificer Whitley, were trapped inside when X7's hull finally gave out, and she sank. They couldn't get through the hatch. They were gone. Place and Sub-Lieutenant Aitken were pulled from the water by a German boat. They too were taken prisoner. The Tirpitz did not sink. She never did. Not that day. But the damage was extraordinary. 1,430 tons of water flooded through the ruptured hull into her fuel tanks and void spaces. The main gun turret Dora was thrown clean off its bearings. It could not be rotated, and there was no crane in the whole of Norway powerful enough to lift it back. Both of the battleship's Arado floatplanes were destroyed by the concussion. Every generator in one electrical room was knocked out. Power cables were severed throughout the ship. 1 German sailor was killed. 40 were wounded. The repair ship Newmark was dispatched. Her engineers worked for 6 months. Historians later described what they accomplished as one of the most notable feats of naval engineering of the entire Second World War. The Tirpitz returned to operational status on April 2, 1944. She was bombed again the following day. Cameron and Place were taken to Mar-Lago, the German naval officer prisoner of war camp at Vestertimke. They would spend the remainder of the war behind wire. They were awarded the Victoria Cross in October 1943. Both men were in German custody when the news reached them. The citations read in part, "For great valor in the face of almost insuperable obstacles." Sub-Lieutenant Lorimer, Sub-Lieutenant Kendall, and Sub-Lieutenant Aitken received the Distinguished Service Order. Engine Room Artificer Goddard received the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. Sub-Lieutenant Whittam and Engine Room Artificer Whitley were dead. Lieutenant Henty Creer and the 3 other men of X5 were dead. Their bodies were never recovered. X9's passage crew, Caron, Hart, Hawlett, were dead. Their submarine lay on the seabed of the North Atlantic. For 6 months, from September 1943 through early April 1944, the Tirpitz was out of action. She could not threaten the Arctic convoys. The Royal Navy could move ships to other theaters. The supply route to the Soviet Union ran without the shadow that had hung over it since 1942. In those 6 months, Allied forces landed in Italy. The Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively against the U-boats. Planning for the Normandy invasion reached its final stages. The Tirpitz had been neutralized by 4 men in a submarine with a bus engine, operated from a hotel on the Isle of Bute. Operation Source proved something that military planners had suspected but could not confirm, that even the most heavily defended naval anchorage in the world could be penetrated by the right team with the right tool. The concept of the midget submarine, already proven, would be developed further. XE craft went on to cut underwater telegraph cables, to attack ships in Singapore Harbor in 1945, to win more Victoria Crosses. One man who went to Norway as a diver in 1943, James McGuinness, who served as the passage crew diver aboard X7, would go on to earn his own Victoria Cross in 1945, attacking the Japanese heavy cruiser Takao in Singapore. A man who helped carry Cameron and place his X-craft across the North Sea would become one of the last Victoria Cross recipients of the entire war. The X7's bow section was recovered from the seabed in 1974 and can be seen today at the Imperial War Museum in London. The periscope barely comes up to a man's chest. The Tirpitz never fired her main guns at an enemy warship. Not once in the entire war. Her greatest contribution to the German war effort was the threat of what she might do. And the paradox of that threat was this: the more carefully she was protected, the easier she was to find. A battleship doesn't disappear. You can only hide it in a fjord, surround it with nets, and pray the enemy doesn't think small enough. Cameron was 26. Place was 22. The men who died were the same age or younger. They towed a bus engine into the Arctic, drove it under the most powerful warship in Europe, left behind a package no bigger than a family car, and changed the course of the naval war. They were called midget submarines. Nothing about what those crews did was small.